NoCal's 2022 Spring Institute. I wanted to start by thanking my committee, who obviously I could not have done this without. So Delia Montesinos, Tina Dumas, April Udy, Lucy Berry, Holly Riccio, Jocelyn Stillwell-Tong, and Christine Sellers-Sullivan. I'd also like to thank our panelists and speakers on both the librarian and the vendor side. Your participation and your commitment to continuing education is greatly appreciated. General housekeeping stuff. Please make sure you're muted during the presentations. It looks like 98% of you are, so that's great. I appreciate it. So it may not seem like it, but I swear it's the truth. I honestly started thinking about themes for our Spring Institute way back late summer of fall of last year. And given all of this, there was really only one thing that came to mind and really kind of underscored the notion that our mandate to provide open and ready access to information seems like it's never been more important. And to that end, I wanted to lead into our keynote speaker. Let me give you his bio. I always love it when people provide biographies that make them sound like Batman, and Eric's is no exception. So by day, Eric Stroshane manages the Hazelwood neighborhood location of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. By night, he works the censorship and privacy beat as news editor for the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy, the Intellectual Freedom blog, and the Voices for Privacy blog. He also diligently updates the Office for Intellectual Freedom's banned books database with far too many records. He spends his free time with his tiny family making art and music, paddling about on lakes and rivers, and hiking and biking through the rewilded post-industrial wastelands of Western Pennsylvania. I'd like to welcome to our presentation, Eric Stroshane. Thanks, Eric.
Hello, everybody in Northern California. I'm just gonna take a moment here to start sharing my slides, but I am incredibly grateful to be visiting with you today. All right, let's see, here we go. All right, can you see the slide deck?
Yep, you're good.
Beautiful. All right, so when Jeremy reached out to ask if I'd be willing to present a session on, whoa, I just dropped something on my keyboard. A session on the lay of the land for intellectual freedom in US libraries, I said, of course I would. I was overwhelmingly excited for the opportunity to talk to a bunch of tiny heads in boxes about these incredibly weighty moral issues. And this is what all of our meetings are these days and have been for a couple of years now. Yeah, so instead of just unloading all of this on my therapist like I do most weeks, I get to unload it on you. Incidentally, she thanks you for this invaluable service. So the first question, of course, that you're probably wondering about is what exactly are we talking about when we talk about intellectual freedom? To answer that, we are going to have to go all the way back to the Bill of Rights librarians. And by that, I mean the Library Bill of Rights, which proudly proclaims, 1, books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all people the community serves. Materials should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. 2, libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues. Materials should not be prescribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. 3, libraries should challenge censorship in the fulfillment of their responsibility to provide information and enlightenment. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Library Bill of Rights was adopted on June 19th, 1939, 3 months before Germany invaded Poland, beginning World War II. It was drafted as a response to rising totalitarianism and the book burnings taking place in Nazi Germany. It positioned library professionals as a bulwark against authoritarian efforts to silence voices and restrict access to ideas. So that's a very brief history of a key ethical underpinning of our shared profession. Now, you might be wondering how I, Eric Stroschein, became intrigued by censorship efforts and actively involved in opposing them. Well, let me tell you, way back in 1992, at the tender age of 13, when I went to purchase this album called The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, I couldn't, because, as fate would have it, soon-to-be Second Lady Tipper Gore had overheard her daughter singing along with a Prince song that mentioned masturbation. She was so disturbed by this, she fought ardently to spare other parents from enduring a similar fate. As a result of her efforts, the cassette that I rollerbladed clear across Lincoln, Nebraska to purchase had this sticker on it when I arrived. Because of that, the guy at the record store refused to accept the money I'd earned mowing lawns, out of fear for what might befall my parents if they heard me singing along to it. That night, when I told my folks about what happened, they drove me back to the record store and bought me the tape. And as we listened to it on the car ride home, we discovered, somewhat ironically, that it contained songs sampling dialogue from the films Fahrenheit 451 and 1984, as well as lyrics impugning the moral character of Richard Nixon. And I'm not joking. This was absolutely the moment when the seed of anti-censorship work took purchase in my tiny skull. And this is also how my parents nurtured it. So that was then. What am I doing now that cassettes are all but unplayable, music is mostly streamed, and rollerblades aren't even retro cool? Well, as Jeremy mentioned, I've assisted the Office for Intellectual Freedom, primarily in various volunteer capacities since 2014. I am currently news editor of the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy, depicted here. The journal, if you aren't familiar with it, serves as the public record of efforts to censor the materials at public schools, libraries, museums, and institutions of higher ed throughout the US. I'm also one of the people who updates and maintains the OIF's database of censorship case files. Now, I do think it's important to point out that the Office for Intellectual Freedom does incredibly important work, but they only have 2 full-time staff, and they are Deborah Caldwell-Stone and Kristen Pico. Without a doubt, 2 of the most inspiring and dedicated people I have ever had the privilege to meet. And if they possess shortcomings, it is that they are, in fact, only 2 people. And if you haven't noticed, there has been a lot of IF news and work afoot of late. So one last thing before we dive deep into the current state of intellectual freedom in the US, I think it's important that we take a moment to ensure we have a shared understanding around the way certain terms are used within this particular context. Reconsideration indicates someone has requested that the library reconsider their decision to select a book, display, or program. Most libraries have a policy governing this process and an official form that must be filled out and submitted to initiate it. Once a request for reconsideration has been received, we say that the material it pertains to has been challenged. If material is removed from a library's collection as a result of a reconsideration process, we say that it has been withdrawn or banned from the library. If reconsideration results in the relocation of a book to a different section of the library, such as to the adult section or to a staff area where it can't be freely browsed, we say that access to it has been restricted. When there is no change to the availability of material that was challenged, then access was retained. And finally, when a challenge is reported to the Office for Intellectual Freedom or discovered through media coverage, they open a case file in which all the details of the challenge, all the correspondence, all the support that OIF provides, the outcomes, and all related documentation and metadata are digitally collocated in the database that I mentioned earlier. As law librarians, you're likely unfamiliar with how school and public library reconsideration processes play out. So I'm going to take just a minute to walk you through what this looked like historically to help you appreciate how radically it transformed in this past year. We all know literature grapples with complex and nuanced issues in ways that can at times make us feel uncomfortable. Helping us explore fraught topics is one of its functions. The overwhelming majority of book challenges arise when people who are driven by a desire to protect youth from issues that they themselves are troubled by bring, the challenging materials to the librarians. So typically this looks like someone just approaching the circ desk with a book, such as Hidden Figures, and saying, hey, I checked this out with my kid and I found it to be problematic for X, Y, or Z reason. The first step for the library professional at this point is to meet the complainant with curiosity in a place of compassion. To listen earnestly, learn more about their concerns, and assure them that they've been heard.
We're obviously not excited about what the market's doing.
Sorry, if you're on the call, please make sure to be muted. Thank you.
And then to guide them to books that might serve them better. Next, we explain that just like books, families are wildly variable creatures. Every kid develops emotionally at different rates, has diverse needs, and a unique array of interests. Librarians strive to have materials available to serve all families, and they also genuinely want kids to feel accepted and safe. If the customer insists that a book shouldn't be available, we explain the reconsideration process and guide them to the form that they can fill out. Once a formal reconsideration request is received, a committee is convened to read the book and consider it in its entirety, informed by their expertise, the library's policies, and the patron's concerns. The committee then votes and drafts a report of their findings, including a recommendation for access to the material to either be retained, restricted, or withdrawn. Now, no one's judgment is infallible. Even librarians make dubious decisions, and sometimes a review committee will determine that an item doesn't actually meet our selection criteria or was added to the wrong collection in the library. So while rare, in these instances, requests for reconsideration serve as a most welcome corrective. In cases where items are retained, however, the process still opens a door to connection with the complainant, in which we accept recommendations for books that would better serve them and their family. This method of building a community where we hold differing views about difficult subjects worked well historically. However, a new pattern for challenges gained prominence in the fourth quarter of 2021. A variety of social and cultural forces shaped it, and the information environment we live in enabled it. Today, we'll be looking at how these changes have rapidly altered the library landscape. As you probably expect, request for reconsideration forms provide space for the person challenging the material to specify what they object to. Typically, this is something like profanity, sexually explicit content, depictions of drug use, violence, suicide, or the supernatural. More recently, the focus has shifted to portrayals of queer characters and works discussing race or racism. Last year, a novel justification for reconsideration showed up in a spate of challenges. Which begs the question, how did school library books suddenly become illegal in Texas? Well, this followed the signing into law of Texas House Bill 3979 on July 16, 2021. This law set limits on the ways race, racism, sex, sexism, slavery, the mistreatment of Native Americans, and just inequality generally throughout American history and culture could be taught. In the wake of its passage, school administrators began purging curricula of anything which might make students feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of their race or sex. The sharing of any such knowledge was now strictly forbidden by law. Governor Greg Abbott and Representative Matt Krause went to great lengths to encourage these purges. On October 25th, Krause sent a 16-page spreadsheet of 839 titles to every school district administrator in Texas and requested an itemization of which schools in each district owned each title, how many copies of each title were held, and how much money was spent to purchase them. District administrators were given 2 weeks to complete this task. This kicked off an overwhelming book banning wave in Texas by extending matters far beyond the social studies curriculum and fully into school and classroom libraries. Since then, we've also seen the Krause list used to challenge materials in public libraries, and it's even showing up in reconsideration requests outside of Texas. It's also worth noting that Texas is not alone in passing legislation of this kind. House Bill 3979 is commonly referred to as a critical race theory or divisive concepts ban. PEN America refers to them as educational gag orders, and they've been enacted so far in 15 states. An additional 40 bills targeting K-12 institutions and 14 targeting institutions of higher ed are live nationwide. More on this later, but first, some statistics. So 2 months ago, the American Library Association published their report recapping efforts to ban books in the last calendar year. The numbers represented an unprecedented rise in such efforts. While the numbers are alarming, they only hint at the true scale of what took place in 2021 and has continued as we move through 2022. One thing to keep in mind as we look at these numbers is that we know most challenges go unreported. So the cases tracked by OIF only cover a small percentage of reconsideration requests that take place. The data is useful to paint a picture and to examine trends over time, but it is not comprehensive. Also, fair warning, this is the shape of charts to come. Virtually all the data I have to share with you follows the exact same curve, so they look a little bit samey. I'll do my best to keep things interesting for you otherwise, but I can't really do anything about the numbers. So where are these challenges taking place? Roughly 37% of them took place in public libraries last year. 62% were in schools and school libraries. This alone represents a significant shift because in previous years, challenges occurred most frequently in public libraries. The first thing I'd like to surface for you as we look at the record high case numbers is that the case volume is not the only aspect that increased. The breadth and depth of what a case might encompass grew as well. So prior to last year, it was rare for a case to involve more than a single title. A major case could involve 20 or 30 books, and these would happen only a few times per year. In 2021, OIF started working cases where hundreds of titles were challenged at a time, up to and including the entire 839 title Krause list. Titles also started to be challenged at the school district level instead of at individual schools. So one example of this was when 431 unique titles, primarily off the Krause list, were challenged in the school and classroom libraries of all 75 schools in a San Antonio district serving more than 60,000 students. Now, for perspective, I live and work in Pittsburgh, a humble city supporting 3 professional sports teams, 4 if you include soccer. Now, Pittsburgh Public Schools serves just a hair over 20,000 students. In other words, Northeast ISD is a really big district. Flashing back to see how the unique title count from this single case compares to unique title counts from all cases reported in previous years, starts to suggest that there are certain limitations to the data we've been compiling. When we zoom out to look at the composite of titles challenged across all cases, we start to see a more accurate depiction of last year's challenge. and like the escalation in challenges. However, once again, the data we've compiled historically does us a disservice. Here's why. For the longest time, a case involved only one school, one library, one service outlet. So what's missing, the number of service outlets per case, was never documented. It simply never occurred to anyone to record a number that was always one. And why would it? Starting in 2021, what I would call major cases like the Northeast ISD case effectively have an invisible multiplier. So 431 titles times 75 schools equals, stupidly big number. And if that weren't enough, there's still a piece missing. Another thing OIF has never documented is the number of copies of each title that's involved in a case. For an example of how that can factor in, consider an ongoing case involving curricula at the Rapid City Area School District in South Dakota. Only 5 titles are involved, but the fate of 355 physical books hangs in the balance. When you are tackling curricula, there are multiple copies of each book, for each classroom, like each student in each classroom that it's being taught in. So it's easy, really easy to get lost in the numbers game. But ultimately, it's not particularly useful unless you are actively stockpiling nightmare fuel, which I would advise against. Now, the second major shift I'd like to highlight from 2021 was the coalescence of an organized movement driving censorship efforts. So this includes fundraising, marketing materials, talking points, target lists, planning documents, spreadsheets, and even apparel being furnished nationwide through organizations such as Moms for Liberty. For a specific data point showcasing the impact of these organized efforts, let's look at how they focus challenges against specific titles. Now, for the longest time, the American Library Association has published lists of the 10 most challenged titles each year. These are the little cropped images from the covers of 2021's top 10. Looking at the past 5 years, you see the challenge count for the year's most frequently challenged title amps up a smidge from what was an average of 8 challenges per year all the way to 121. So how extraordinary is it for a title to be challenged 121 times in a year? We have to look at the full data set to get a real perspective here. So at the end of 2020, Genderqueer, which was the title that got those challenges, was sitting at 2 total challenges, unassumingly tied with roughly 1,450 other books for the dubious honor of being the 1,853rd most challenged title. At the end of 2021, it sat alone as the most challenged title of all time, surpassing the 119 challenges that Robert Cormier's The Chocolate War had spent nearly 50 years of hard work and swear words accumulating. So the third drumbeat in the 2021 censorship dirge is that there was a significant drop in the rate at which access to materials was retained. Historically, titles were retained more than 50% of the time as a result of requests for reconsideration. Last year, that rate plummeted to 30%. One contributing factor is that formal reconsideration processes typically include a mechanism for appealing the outcome. In the appeals process, either a school board or a public library's governing board serves as the ultimate arbiter. In 2021, conservative PACs started funneling at times hundreds of thousands of dollars into individual school and library board elections. This resulted in the very deliberate transformation of what were historically nonpartisan positions. And it altered who handles reconsideration appeals. Take for an example, last year's election of the board of the Community Library Network in Kootenai County, Idaho. In the lead up to the election, only candidates who publicly committed to removing LGBTQIA+ titles from library shelves were supported by the Kootenai County Republican Central Committee. Now, Idaho is a deeply red state, and the seal of approval of the Republican Central Committee is functionally a prerequisite for electability. Subsequently, incumbents were ousted, and a new era of censorship was ushered in. This is a good place to reiterate that what is currently being targeted are almost exclusively works with authors and central characters who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and or members of the LGBTQIA+ community. In other words, this represents a concerted effort to silence voices and eliminate representation of historically marginalized peoples. The Southlake Families Political Action Committee provides us with another example. On their website and social media accounts, the PAC explicitly opposes anti-racism efforts, including those led by students and alumni. Last year, the PAC made substantial contributions to the campaigns of 2 candidates for the Carroll Independent School District Board, both of whom were elected as a result. After that election, Southlake Families PAC tweeted, "Critical race theory ain't coming here." The PAC's cherry-picked candidates went on to undermine the school district's adoption of a cultural competency plan, prevent the hiring of a director of equity and inclusion, and they reprimanded Carroll ISD's 2020 Teacher of the Year for having Tiffany Jules' "This book is anti-racist" in her classroom library. This last act prompted the school district's administrators to close every classroom library until all the books in each library could be vetted. These political movements and pressures have created boards that initiate challenges to materials, terminate directors who support intellectual freedom, eliminate EDI positions, revise reconsideration policies in order to remove trained librarians from the decision-making process, attempt to assume control of material selection, and even to propose book burnings. To return us to what got us started on this little jaunt, when book challenges get appealed to boards such as these, the board eschews the principles of intellectual freedom, instead voting to withdraw or restrict access to any materials that contain ideas and viewpoints they disagree with. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're law librarians. You're wondering, what about students' First Amendment rights? Isn't removing books from school libraries because of the ideas they espouse strictly verboten? I'm so glad you asked. It turns out the courts are on your side, law librarians. And here's some case law grist for your metaphorical mills. In Tinker, the Supreme Court ruled that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. Building on that finding, in Minarcini versus Strongville, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that a library is a storehouse of knowledge. When created for a public school, it is an important privilege created by the state for the benefit of the students in the school. That privilege is not subject to being withdrawn by succeeding school boards whose members might desire to winnow the library for books, the content of which occasioned their displeasure or disapproval. Similarly, in the landmark Supreme Court case, Island Trees v. Pico, in a split plurality decision, Justice Blackmun wrote that school officials may not remove books from school libraries for the purpose of restricting access to the political ideas or social perspectives discussed in the books when that action is motivated simply by the official's disapproval of the ideas involved. And yet, somehow, politicians are successfully fundraising and campaigning on promises to ban books and restrict curricula based on their ideas and expressions. Take, for example, the man who is now governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. In the lead up to his election, Youngkin ran a 60-second ad featuring Laura Murphy, the mother whose efforts to remove Toni Morrison's beloved from high school classrooms statewide were derailed by the man who is now former Governor Terry McAuliffe. Toni Morrison called book bannings from schools the purest and yet most elementary kind of censorship, designed to appease adults rather than educate children. McAuliffe called it like he saw it, stating, "Book banning and silencing esteemed Black authors is a racist dog whistle." Nonetheless, the swing state swung, and on January 15th, his first day in office, Youngkin signed an executive order prohibiting the teaching of inherently divisive concepts, including critical race theory, from public schools. Then, on January 24th, Youngkin announced the creation of a tip line for reporting public school teachers suspected of teaching divisive concepts. The final and arguably most disturbing novelty that 2021 brought us was the filing of criminal reports against librarians and administrators for the brazen act of providing children and teens access to books which their parents don't approve of. This happened 27 times from October through December of 2021. And while unprecedented, the idea did not emerge out of the ether. Rather, this is a strategy that was formulated by Mass Resistance, an organization the Southern Poverty Law Center categorizes as an anti-LGBTQ hate group. The push to effectively criminalize librarianship was brought into the mainstream through the efforts of people like North Carolina Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, who uses his platform to urge parents to report school librarians to the police if their children come home with books containing LGBTQIA+ characters. So what are some examples of the allegedly criminal acts that librarians have performed in the line of duty? Well, in Campbell County, Wyoming, a criminal complaint was lodged against library employees for disseminating and promoting obscene material and committing sexual intrusion on minors. What did the employees do to bring about these criminal charges? Well, they shelved the books. This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson, How Do You Make a Baby by Anna Fisk, Doing It, Let's Talk About Sex by Hannah Witten, Sex is a Funny Word by Corey Silverberg, and Dating and Sex, A Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy by Andrew Smiler. In his investigations, Special Prosecutor Michael Stulkin determined that under Wyoming law, the disputed books were not obscene, and that having them in the library's children and teen sections did not constitute engaging in sexual intrusion. That's probably not surprising, but I think it's worth noting. Now, another example. In Hudson, Ohio, Mayor Craig Schubert threatened the board members of the Hudson City School District with criminal charges of distributing child pornography in the classroom. How did this happen? Well, a high school college level course used writing prompts from the book 642 Things to Write About by Poe Bronson. Now, prosecutor Sherry Brevin Walsh determined that under Ohio law, a prompt about fictional writing is not child pornography. That's an exact quote. Walsh also noted that these allegations have resulted in threats being made against board members, faculty, and administrators in Hudson. Those threats must stop. This is par for the course. To date, no prosecutions of librarians have resulted from the investigations prompted by such criminal reports. However, harassment, death threats, character assassinations, and resignations have. And while circulating library books is not against the law, in February of this year, bills began getting introduced to state legislatures in an effort to change that. Indiana Senate Bill 17 was the first of these. Under this bill, it would become a felony to provide a child with obscene material at a school or public library. In public testimony, supporters of the bill cited the following books as examples of obscene material: How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, It's Perfectly Normal by Roby Harris, and George by Alex Gino, which is now published as Melissa. Last I checked, bills of this nature have been introduced in Arizona, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Utah, and Virginia. Iowa. In Iowa, Senate President Jake Chapman has been aggressively omnipresent, manifesting at the Johnston School Board meeting on November 18th to assert that if the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian by Sherman Alexie or The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas were, quote, in my school, I'd be going to law enforcement. I would be asking for a criminal investigation. I would be asking for every single teacher who disseminated that information to be held criminally responsible. He also promised to use his powers to make stricter laws and to create a felony charge for teachers who provide access to obscene library books. On Facebook, he also promised to create an avenue for parents to pursue civil action against teachers. Chapman repeated these same claims 4 days later at a meeting of the Urbandale School Board, where challenges to All Boys Aren't Blue, Genderqueer, Hey Kiddo, and Lawn Boy were being discussed. Schools and libraries have started preemptively removing material as legislation like this looms. Others are holding off on ordering new titles until the situation crystallizes and administrative guidance is provided. So let's sit with this minute, because it moves toward the heart of another impossible to quantify issue. That there is an ensuing chilling effect that follows even failed efforts to censor materials, especially when people with authority initiate those efforts or acquiesce to them. These efforts also send a heartbreaking message to members of the communities being stripped of their literary representations, that you are somehow inappropriate for being who you are, that you are dangerous, that others need to be protected from knowing people like you exist. For more information on these recent legislative efforts to codify censorship and criminalize librarianship, I would refer you to PEN America's work tracking these bills, as well as to the news coverage that's rolled up weekly by OIF. This is some heavy stuff. So let's just take a breath, take a drink of water. And now for something completely different. Or two things I never thought I'd be writing about getting dropped during library board meetings. So this happened. After brandishing the sex toy she brought to a school board meeting, Lori Hines approached the table that the board was seated at and dropped it in front of them, proclaiming, "This is what you're having our children read." The video of this meeting went viral. So, part of the fallout from the pandemic is that, hey, meetings like this one are virtual and they're broadcast and preserved on YouTube, and they have ensured that crap like this are going to live on forever. And this also allowed for the creation of a blueprint for producing your own viral board meeting. And there are a lot of these now. It turns out bringing props like this and shouting at library board members and school board members about child pornography while wearing a t-shirt sold by Moms for Liberty is basically all it takes. This also happened. And again, this is not an isolated incident. Board meetings nationwide have had to increase security due to the confluence of death threats, armed attendees, and appearances from out-of-town militant extremists, such as the Proud Boys. But California, that's the rest of America. California, you're probably wondering what's been happening on the censorship front at the local level. I am very happy to report that you're bucking the trend, California. 2021 was not a remarkable year for you in terms of the overall number of cases. Like you look at this, 2020, definitely an aberration. School was primarily virtual. Public libraries' doors were closed and providing service curbside. Programs were canceled. Shelf browsing was impossible. Displays were pointless. Circulation was pretty anemic. We all had other things on our minds. Here we see that, well, 2021 had the most titles in a single case in the past 5 years. It was only one more than what occurred in 2020 and in 2019. So it was not really in line with the massive uptick that we saw when looking at the national picture. There was a small spike in 2021 in terms of the total titles challenged. However, California did not see the sort of concerted effort to challenge titles that the rest of the country did. In many ways, California's censorship climate remains different from that of swing states like Pennsylvania, Florida, and Virginia, and red states like Texas and all the other ones that are just brimming with cows. And how do we know this? Well, 27 of the 29 titles challenged in California last year were unique. Of Mice and Men and To Kill a Mockingbird topped the list with 2 challenges each. And this is what you expect in the blue state, where it is far more common for books to be challenged because they contain racist language as opposed to anti-racist content. And this is not to imply that such challenges are less worthy of resistance. The principles of intellectual freedom guide us to oppose censorship in all its incarnations. And it is our duty to defend expressions regardless of whether or not we agree with them. And if you're wondering, Of Mice and Men is the 5th most challenged book of all time. To Kill a Mockingbird is the 20th. Today, I focused on challenges from the right, as the right has spearheaded the radical challenges and changes that have emerged in the past year. But that said, it's important to recognize that censorship efforts come from all ends of the political spectrum. Finally, while 2021 saw no substantive shift in the volume, scope, or targets of censorship in California, there are signs that change is coming. The counties depicted in yellow now have Moms for Liberty chapters. They are the face of organized censorship efforts. They are well-resourced and staunchly determined. So look, I'm going to level with you. With the exception of the good news for California, things are pretty bleak out there. Make no mistake, what's happening now is a symptom, one that is emblematic of the rise of domestic extremism. Viewed alongside things like the rollback of reproductive rights, women's rights, trans rights, gay rights, voting rights, as well as the rise of mass domestic surveillance, it is easy to conclude that our democracy is moving backwards and under threat. Even so, there are times when we can laugh about the absurdity of these challenges, and that's good. Hold on to that. You need it. But never make the mistake of taking censorship efforts or the organizations advancing them lightly. Even when their actions are laughable, they are strident and purposeful. The groups and activities the Library Bill of Rights positioned our profession in ethical opposition to are on the rise, and a complex confluence of factors is contributing to their growing popularity and to their success. Efforts to censor minority voices are only becoming more common, brazen, and openly hateful. But as bad as things have gotten, we are still librarians, and we're still here. We have a duty, and more than that, we have the best possible reason to keep the hope alive. The youth of America. In the face of this relentless shit show, they are doing things like this, and this, and this. They are taking protests to the streets. They are speaking out at board meetings to defend their right to read and proclaim their love of the books that are being challenged. They are testifying before Congress. They are reading and discussing the books that Moms for Liberty are terrified of. But don't think for a second that their hard work means we can punt or bow out. At pivotal times like these, complacency is not an option. If you are concerned about anything I've spoken to you about today, it behooves you to follow their lead. How do you pick up their mantle? What can you do to support the cause of intellectual freedom and allow these bright young beacons to shine to their fullest? You can familiarize or reacquaint yourself with the resources on this slide. You can monitor the agendas for upcoming library and school board meetings in your area. City council and county commission meetings too, by the way. Whenever you see book challenges, critical race theory, or anything else smacking of oppression on the docket, show up and speak out against efforts to censor and oppress. Vote in every election, especially small local ones, where your vote represents a much greater percentage of the overall electorate. Do what you can to support and amplify young folks' voices. Lord only knows what they can accomplish when we're not standing in their way. Also, read some banned books, cherish them, talk about them with those you love, recommend them to strangers, embrace the ideas that they contain, because the ideas that inspire this much fear are worthy of your attention. And that is what I prepared for you today, but I would very much like to turn it over to questions at this point. We've got time for them. And yeah, my contact info is on the screen. If you want to reach out to me afterwards, please always feel free to do so. And let me see if I can bring it up.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was fantastic. And in the 20 plus years that I've been doing this, this is the first panel presentation for a library group that had a ministry reference. So got to give you mad props for that. We do, as Eric said, we do have questions. If you have any questions for Eric, please remember to take yourself off mute and fire away.
Thanks, Pete.
Well, it looks like you covered all your bases, Eric. I went from being enraged to hopeful at the very end there, but yeah, that was a lot to think about. Michaela, do you have a question?
I have a question, but I also kind of want to introduce myself. I'm a, thank you. I'm actually a San Jose State student.
What you doing, honey?
I'm a, didn't expect that reaction, but I'm actually, sorry, I'm a little nervous.
Oh no, go ahead, please.
I'm actually looking at special librarianship as a goal. I'm still taking classes, and I'm going for my master's in information and library sciences. And I kind of want to establish myself among the special librarian community. So I hope I haven't offended anyone too terribly right now.
No, of course not. We're happy to have you here.
But yeah, I just wanted to thank Eric for this extraordinary presentation. It was an interesting and refreshing thing to to listen to. Very
Absolutely.
timely also.
Absolutely.
So again, thank you.
Thank you, Michaela.
Anyone else?
I had a question. This is Patty Trackman. Eric, with the current composition of the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, do you see trending towards efforts to create national banned book lists, national pronouncements?
So I don't think that legislatively, like we're going to be able to, efforts can move that way at the federal level right now, thankfully. So it's really kind of state legislative efforts that, where we're seeing these bills introduced. However, I will say that the model legislation for all of the sort of critical race theory bans and divisive concept bans actually stemmed from a Trump era executive order. And that kind of got spearheaded when a dude named Christopher Rufo appeared on the Tucker Carlson show on August 13th of 2020. And he started talking about critical race theory. And this is kind of what got the big ball rolling for these legislative efforts and these bans. And he, on the Tucker Carlson show, he's like, hey, President Trump, call me. And next day he was talking to someone from the Trump administration. And then an executive order banning kinds of federal employee or like federally funded, like grant funded organization to offer or like anyone to take part in trainings that had these sort of divisive concepts taught. So things like equity, diversity, and inclusion work, anti-racism work were forbidden. And then that has kind of become the model for legislation that we've seen introduced at the state legislative level. Rufo works for a number of conservative think tanks, or he has. I forget which one he's at right now. But yeah, he's been involved in drafting model legislation. So that was not exactly the answer to your question, but yeah, obviously there's fear about how cases before the Supreme Court could influence like efforts to censor and like any other kind of First Amendment or civil right. But yeah, the Congress is not really entertaining bills of this nature right now. So I guess there's that.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. I think you said there were 2 full-time people and that you were a volunteer. How many volunteers does that group have?
Yeah, so there are volunteers, and there's some some contract gigs, just kind of like helping serve as stopgap measures. I know, let's see, there are, I think, 6 people who currently have access to the banned books database. There's myself, there's Kim Deinholt, Deborah Caldwell Stone, Kristen Pico, 2 other people whose names I haven't actually met them, so their names escape me right now. And then there's just kind of general administrator. So yeah, it's not a big crew. It's a lot. It's really a lot.
So have you brought on more people or has the organization brought on more people because of the uptick from 2021?
Yeah, they definitely have, and they're, always reaching out to other people like members of the Intellectual Freedom Roundtable for the American Library Association, for example. Yeah, so whoever they can draw in and like enlist, they're certainly happy to welcome to the fold. There are there's a huge cadre of bloggers for the Intellectual Freedom blog. So a lot of academic librarians are there. Yeah, if you're interested in helping out, that's certainly one place that I know a lot of people are contributing to.
Do we have any other questions for Eric? All right, well, I will thank you again, Eric. As a reminder to everybody on the call, our registration for Spring Institute, the proceeds from that are all going to the Office of Intellectual Freedom. So we appreciate your attendance from that perspective as well. Remember, Eric's contact information is available. And so please join me in thanking Eric for his presentation. We have a break now before our next session, which is on legal research and ethics. That starts at 10 a.m. So feel free to stretch your legs and be sure to be back at 10 o'clock where we will take up the next session. Thanks again, everybody. See you soon.